Okay, we are now recording, so we'll go ahead and get started with today's workshop, Making Research Data Management Easier. We've got a couple people in the room here, literally, and we've got, it looks like a number of folks online as well. So as I go forward, please don't hesitate to raise your hand, to put something in the chat. We've got somebody who can pick up those things and make sure your question gets asked, and feel free to jump in at any time with your questions, and I'm happy to address them as we go. My name is Jeremy Kenyon. I am a research librarian here at the University of Idaho. I am the librarian principally for data management related topics and for the College of Natural Resources specifically. So I work with a lot of folks on questions about handling their data and doing research in a variety of different ways. And so today's talk is going to cover a number of different things. Let's make sure this is working. There we go. After this little introduction, we'll talk briefly, just a quick mention of something called the Data Hub here at the library, and then we'll get into the meat of the talk, which are different tips that I have for making your data management life easier. Some of these deal with kind of tabular scientific data, but some of these also deal with other forms of data as well, note-taking and literature and those kinds of contexts. So there's a wide range covered in this session. Different people registered for this. We're coming from all sorts of different disciplines, so it's really hard to be specific. So if there's something in your area that you're interested in me talking more about, please feel free to ask a question about that, and where appropriate, and I will try to answer it. Okay. So as I said, I wanted to mention one service provided by the library specifically around data and data management. And that's an area we call the Data Hub. So this is a room here in the library located in our map room on the first floor. It's a location staffed by librarians 5 days a week, 11 to 3, in order to help people with questions they have about using GIS, about data sciences work, programming, and so on. In about 6 months, we're hoping to have better integration with computer science as well, to provide some support that way. So this is an area that's open. You're always free to come and work in there. There's tables and monitors and other things that you can hook into and do work on. So if there's a need to do that while you're here in Moscow on the campus, you're welcome to do so. We're also available over chat. So if you go to our website on the library webpage, you'll be able to chat with whoever's working there between 11 and 3 Pacific time. So just a plug for that. Okay, I'm going to talk about kind of 8 different tips that I have for making your data management life easier. They're a little sort of unique to each individual tip. So we'll kind of flip around from topic to topic as we go here. But tip number 1 is to back up your data, which is not something that I think anybody needs to be reminded of, but sometimes putting that into practice is a little bit of a challenge. So people have problems all the time with corrupted data. Their laptop or their hard drive fails. They make mistakes, they delete things. There's other forms of user error. There's sometimes catastrophic things like your laptop was on a fire, something like that. So lots of things happen. So the way we can resolve that conflict is to make sure we have it backed up. Generally speaking, the sort of method out there is the 3-2-1 rule. So the idea is that you're going to have 3 copies of your data. You're going to store them in at least 2 different forms of media or 2 different kind of places. But then one place is going to be off-site. So you want it to be geographically differentiated in case there's something catastrophic that happens in one particular place. This used to be a lot more of a challenge than it is today. Increasingly with cloud storage capabilities, it kind of takes care of the geographic replication for you. So if you've got something on OneDrive, if you have it on some other cloud storage mechanism like Google Drive or something like that, that gives you that offsite storage mechanism. For data that can't be stored in that way, there are services through Research Computing and Data Services here at the university that can probably help you figure out a strategy for making sure that things are replicated in a useful way. They've got offsite storage down at the Idaho National Lab, and they can kind of provide replication services in a very cloud-like way. Otherwise, just a good rule of thumb is, the working copy that you usually have on your hard drive or something like that, and then having another copy on a physical media device like a backup hard drive or something like that is always a good idea. So with all of those, you end up with multiple copies in multiple places. Usually you have a workflow of some sort to get them kind of updated as you're continuing to work, so they're not out of sync with each other. And then, yeah, if something happens, you're going to be in pretty good shape. So try to remember the 3-2-1 rule, and figure out a system that will work for you based on the tools and the resources that you work with on a regular basis. All right. Tip number 2, try not to modify raw data as you're working with it. You want to version what you're doing so that you have kind of different stages of your research saved and protected in different places. So I have a sort of workflow diagram on the screen here. The idea with what you're seeing is that the blue boxes represent data sets, and the green represent different processes that this person is going through. And so what you can see here is they've got original raw data, the temperature and salinity data. That's being combined into a raw data set. They're presumably going through a bunch of effort and a bunch of work to bring those together, to integrate them. They're going through even more work to clean and prepare that data for analysis. And then there's all sorts of, through the analysis process in this example, there's all sorts of different exploratory techniques they might be using, and different ways of looking at their data. So you end up generating at least usually some kind of summary statistics from it, but probably a number of other things as well. And what you want to keep in mind is that as you're going through a workflow, and it's always a good idea to think through the workflow before you get into it as much as you can, come up with sort of checkpoints where you're going to produce a data set, and then you'll have sort of a copy of your data at that point. With sort of modern techniques like this, where you're using R or you're using Python, you can automate this process pretty seamlessly. So you run it once, and then each time you make changes, you can run it through and reproduce all of these data sets as you go. But this gives you the ability to go back and fix things. If you make a mistake, you can kind of go back a step and check and see what maybe changed that you didn't intend to change, and so on. But if you modify the raw data that you got, you're going to have to start all over again every single time. Or worse, you may make a change that is simply a loss, and you have no idea what you did and how. So keep in mind versioning. There are tools like Git and GitHub that, particularly for certain kinds of data for programming, can enable versioning in a much more comprehensive way. But even if you don't use tools like that, a process sort of like this is a really good way to make sure that versioning happens. This is also true if you're dealing with qualitative data. It's not just a quantitative sort of issue. So one other kind of approach you can take in terms of versioning your data is if you really do have small data, and that's often the case when you're working in a class context, or you're working on some projects where you're just collecting a spreadsheet's worth of stuff, and maybe laborious to produce that spreadsheet, but that's really all it is. It's just, a relatively small couple of megabytes of data. You can actually just copy the entire directory of all of your files and all of your projects. And so you just do that periodically to make sure that you've got versions of it. So this is effectively what GitHub does for you, but you can also do this manually. And then push those, as we said in the first tip, push those to your external storage drives and other things to make sure that you have it backed up and saved in case you have any issues. So different ways you can go, either copy your whole project or make sure you're producing sort of checkpoint data sets at various stages of your research process. Oh, yeah.
A lot of the tools that we have access to here on campus, like the Microsoft suite of services, have that automatic kind of version control built in. Is it still a good idea to save separate files instead of just relying on like Microsoft's version control?
I would say yes, in the sense of I find the Microsoft system to be a little opaque. That, I mean, when you're working on just this, like a Word document, like you're writing a paper in a Word document, I think that version control works pretty effectively. But if you're working across multiple data sets, across different tools that maybe you take stuff out of a Microsoft environment and then back in, so you have Excel spreadsheets, you put them in some kind of analysis tool, and then you output spreadsheets again. It's not going to pick up all those kinds of changes. There are workflow tools that will sort of capture the entire environment you're working in, but that's pretty kind of advanced stuff for most people. So yeah, I'm not a huge fan of relying on that as my form of version control. It's kind of nice with Word documents, but that's about it. Yeah. Okay. Tip number 3 is to generally try to use as clear, unambiguous data values as much as possible. And so often when we construct data sets or files, we put stuff in spreadsheets, we will use things that are kind of personally recognizable and identifiable. So these are things that you know what it means, and maybe a partner of yours knows what it means, but maybe nobody else would know what it means. And so whenever we're adding something into a data set of any kind, and it has any kind of a standardized identifier out there. So examples are, ISBNs, so those are book numbers, DOIs, which are common with literature, species names, language codes. There's lots of different fields with lots of different standardized ways of talking about things in their field. You use those standardized techniques because those become very clear and obvious to everybody who might be interested in that data, what it is you're talking about and what it is you're recording. If you use things that are too specific or too customized and unique to the way you do things, then it becomes difficult for other people to understand. And honestly, it also can become difficult for you to understand some years down the road. You might look back and say, what was I thinking when I put that in there? And many of us have been in that circumstance. So generally, when you design your data files, try to do so with an eye towards standardizing identifiers as much as possible. And along with that, think a little bit about variable names. So this is a really good example of some of the challenges that you get with variable names. So for example, we look at the first one, the good name max temp C over on the left, all good alternative max temp. We try to avoid max temp ~sign Celsius because among other things, the character encoding for the degree sign can get corrupted when you shift from tool to tool. So Excel has a particular problem with sometimes imposing character encoding on different types of things that you didn't intend to. And so if you're using spreadsheets like that, you could run into all sorts of weird problems as your data goes from file to file. Whereas over on the left, you've got something that is pretty straightforward and pretty clear. And you avoid kind of, I mean, the context of C in that case is pretty clear. We're probably only going to see F or C, but we could see K, I guess. And then they use underscore because in many tools, including command line tools, spaces are used to separate commands. And so often we don't want to actually use spaces in our variable names or even in our file names. If you do any GIS work, spaces will throw things off. And so generally we want to think about how to fix these and clarify them as much as possible. Another good example is sex on there. That's pretty clear in this particular instance of what it is they're looking for. M/F becomes sort of a question mark. If you just saw that as your variable name, M/F, what does that mean? Is it medium versus full? Like what do those things mean? So thinking a little bit about categorization for variable names and clarity can make the process of producing data a lot more effective. But most importantly, in the context of sharing data, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, these things become incredibly important. A couple of other tips on using certain kinds of data values. Think about whether 0 means 0 or whether zero doesn't mean anything. So in many cases, if you put a zero, that means you didn't record, or you tried to record something, but nothing appeared, or what have you. And so don't just use zeros to simply mean this column or this field is blank. In that case, you usually want to pick some kind of a code of some sort, something that you'll document elsewhere in your data set, but is going to be sort of outside of what is realistic for those data values. So like -999 is often used, or null or NA or something like that. And then alternatively, you might have other kinds of error codes to indicate other things. So if your data set is representing some data produced by some instrument that you had out in the field, maybe that instrument had an error at some point. They got filled with snow or something like that. There was rust affecting its accuracy. And so you want other kinds of error codes to indicate that those kinds of problems existed. And again, you know, we're going to talk about this in a second. You want to document those codes somewhere so that somebody understands what it is that you did. So with that in mind, tip number 4 is create metadata. Like whenever you're handling any kind of data that you're dealing with, you need to create some form of metadata that documents and describes your processes, your procedures, and what it is that people are looking at. And there are so many different ways of creating metadata. We could, in fact, I have in the past done entire workshops on just metadata itself in different ways. We're going to keep it simple here and say, you know, for spreadsheets, for qualitative data where you have codes, some kind of a code list, like you see on the screen, is pretty essential. So it just tells us what those variable names are or what those codes are and gives their definition unique to the kind of data you're working with. So whether it's qualitative or quantitative research that you're doing, you're going to want something like this documented alongside all of your data sets. Your instructors or your advisors or your other team members are all going to appreciate the fact that you put this together. And then when things change, you change the documentation accordingly. So here's a list of all the different kinds of things, or not, I shouldn't say all, but many different kinds of fields that you could include in here, depending on what's relevant. So you might put in minimum, maximum values if there is a specific range that those values should fit. That way, if something falls outside of that range, it's sort of a signal that there's something weird going on. You might indicate the precision of the measurement. So with spatial data and coordinates, we often see that you can be incredibly precise, but it has some cons, or you can be a little too coarse and not very precise, and that also has its pros and cons. And so clarifying that in here could be useful to other people so they understand what it is that you're doing. Okay. So moving to tip number 5. So pick the right tabular format. So this is specific when you're working with tables, but for people who aren't necessarily deeply involved in writing code with R, you might not be familiar with the sort of concept of tidy data. And often what you'll find with spreadsheets and fields like business and other areas, you often end up with what you see on the left, which are the wide data formats. So these are really good for human readable consumption. You want people looking at this, and it's very easy for me to see, and probably for all of you to see, you know, the location column, and then each of these are different years, and there's some value associated with those years. Typically, though, machines prefer something that looks like the long column, or the quote unquote tidy data column. So a lot of visualization tools, so Tableau or some of the Oracle tools, really prefer this to the wide. Excel seems to be able to manage everything. It's a little bit built for people in a different way. R, Python, a lot of other scripting tools prefer the long format as well. It's just easier to keep basically, you know, one observation per row and then one variable per column. And that becomes a standardized way to present the information. It's not so clear to you and me how it's summarized, not like the wide column, but it works a lot better in a lot of tools. And so it becomes a useful way to think about how you should structure and order your data, depending on what it is that you plan to do. You can actually flip back and forth using certain kinds of tools. So you can reshape your data depending on the tool that you're using. Down at the bottom, there's a bunch of kind of standard data analysis tools that people use that all have reshaping features. In R and Python, if you're using those, you've got a couple of commands: gather, spread, pivot, melt, that all sort of allow it to flip back and forth. It's not quite as simple as merely invoking the command, but it's overall not too hard to be able to make those changes once you learn how to do it. So just being aware of those things, being aware of how you have your data structured can help you kind of make all of your processes and workflows easier. Okay, keep going. Tip number 6 is to use standardized date time formats. So this is an example from Excel, which one of the reasons I keep bringing up Excel is it is the dominant tool used across disciplines. It's kind of crazy how many times people study what tools are used in which fields, and Excel is always at the top of the list. But it does all sorts of fun stuff with dates, as most of us have experienced in our lives. And the problem is, if you're creating a data set and you have a permanent date time stamp of some sort, what you don't want is it to be opened up in an Excel file and just be kind of thrown awry somehow. So there's a standardized way to express it. The good news is if you do this for Excel, it will always read that data that way. But a lot of other tools have built-in techniques for looking at a character string like this and knowing it's a date time format and being able to do various things based on that. So it's ISO standard 8601, and it is exactly as you can see on the screen there: year, month, date. There's usually some kind of middle thing indicating separating basically the date and the time, and then the times information, including time zones. So you can basically say this is this date and time anywhere in the world through this expression. And like I said, most tools, if they see this, they'll know exactly what they're looking at and treat them accordingly as dates. Little echo in here on our microphone. Okay. Tip number 7 is assume others will see your data. And so this is a tip that's kind of oriented towards where most academic fields are headed. This is about ethics, and this is a reminder that other people may, for a variety of reasons, see your work. So I remember being in graduate school and hearing an anthropologist refer to all their field notes as dirty laundry. It was this all this stuff they created. They don't expect anybody to ever see. They're going to see the output, the manuscript, or whatever it is that they produced, the dissertation, etc. Increasingly in science, the data that you're collecting, your steps, your processes, these things are going to be aired. Your dirty laundry is going to be aired. So try to keep it clean, as it were. And so, yeah, you see all this in terms of data publishing and sharing, reproducibility, storing data in repositories. We hear from graduate students on a regular basis that are working in labs around campus that they have to do these kinds of things. They have to put their data somewhere so that reviewers can look at it and so on. And so keep all of this in mind as you're working. And I think it'll actually reduce the fear and anxiety that you will have about your work if you are maintaining good practices while you're working. So, develop those practices. It's a self-discipline kind of activity like anything else in your life, where you just have to keep working at it and keep doing it as best as you can. And eventually you'll act in ways that are going to be, I think, successful for you. And just as a reminder here of that, here's an example. During COVID, there was a lot of studies about using different kinds of medicine in response to COVID. And here's an example from Nature Medicine, where they talked about how in order to evaluate those researchers' studies of ivermectin, they were requesting those researchers' data. In other words, those researchers weren't planning to share their data. They just shared their results. They published their paper. They did the thing that you're supposed to do in science. But other people in their field are saying, well, let's see what's under the hood. Let's look at it. And so if you are walking into this with an awareness that you're going to be sharing your data, this is less of a scary thing for you. You're ready for it. I mean, maybe in this case, they knew what they were getting into. I don't know. But generally, you want to keep this in mind. There've also been lots and lots of news stories about, people catching cases of plagiarism that, academics have gone on to great careers, and then it turns out their dissertation was half plagiarized and so on. And that's still another example of, think about your research while you're doing it, be prepared for somebody to come back and look at your work, and just make sure you're following processes and procedures that make sense. Okay, so on tip number 8, I wanted to make sure that we also covered some stuff for more qualitative information and working with literature, since for some people that is research data management, even though it doesn't involve spreadsheets and all that. And so I want to just highlight a couple of sort of note-taking approaches that are out there, in case those are of interest to you. For a number of people, that's what kind of makes their research process work for producing, books and lots of other things. So note card systems are a very, very old technique. There's a great book that I think every graduate student should look at by Umberto Eco called How to Write a Thesis. And in it, he describes his technique for creating note cards. And so he's got all these different sort of indexes of literal note cards and boxes that he uses. This is from the 70s, so it's a little back then. But it's a really interesting way of tracking all of the sources that you find, tracking the notes that you have, and all the relationships and linkages between all of them. There's another system known as Zettelkasten, which is a German system that seeks to effectively do the same thing. And it's supposedly helped this guy produce more than 50 books and 600 articles in his career. And then I included a quote down at the bottom by a more recent scholar who said he tried to build a digital Zettelkasten, but it didn't really work, so he prefers note cards. It's just a way of saying, pick a system that works for you. It doesn't really matter which system you use. Make it work for you. You can see down there on the right, somebody has a note card system there where they take notes in various ways. They make printouts and just stick them on cards, whatever works for them to keep track and keep organized all the different things that they find as they're doing their work. Obviously, in 2024, we've got software applications that do much the same thing. So here's a couple of the major ones that are out there. I used to be a bit of a OneNote user. I'm actually now kind of an Obsidian user. I think it's a really useful tool, but it's something to get used to. It's a picture of it down there in the corner. You can draw linkages between different kind of note cards, digital note cards. You can connect it to citation managers, and you can really strengthen your workflow. If you're writing an overleaf or you're producing LaTeX documents as your form of writing, it works really well for that environment as well. So take a look at some of these links if you're interested in finding a note-taking system. And the last piece in that is if you're not already using some sort of manager for citations and literature that you find in the course of your work, there are a number of tools out there. This isn't a workshop on Zotero or Mendeley, but we have had those at the library in the past, and we'll probably continue to have those in the future. So look for those for more details. But in most cases, this is a great resource for just organizing everything that you find. You can store those notes and annotations alongside the PDFs in this environment, and it can make your life a little bit easier and smoother, especially as you're writing theses and dissertations. So, yeah. So those are kind of my tips. Relatively quick journey through those 8. So number 1, back up your data. Remember the 3-2-1 rule. Number 2, try not to modify your raw data, version it whenever you can. Number 3, be intentional with your data values. Think through standardization as you can. Number 4, document your processes. So at least use a data dictionary or code book at minimum. A README file is also a fairly minimal kind of way to make sure that you're documenting things. Think about wide and long data formats if you're working with visualization and spreadsheets. Use standardized date time formats. Your future self will appreciate you doing so. Yeah, think about that others will look at your data and they will inspect the work that you've done. Yeah, certainly they do that at the graduate level and through the graduate process, but they'll do that elsewhere in your life as well. And then number 8, use some kind of a note-taking system. So figure out something that works for you. There are a bunch of tools there. that you can use and apply. Any of those could be the one that makes you productive and successful. So with that, I'll kind of stop for questions or comments or thoughts that other people have. We can go from there. So you can throw things into chat if you're on Zoom. You can raise your hand and ask. We'll unmute you.
What are the major differences in your mind between Obsidian and OneNote? Since you said you used to use OneNote, but kind of shifted to Obsidian.
So OneNote is a Microsoft tool, so it's built into the Microsoft suite, and so you're sort of bound up in that for better or worse. Obsidian is an open source software application, so it's free to use and download. But along with that comes a sort of community mindset. So there are a lot of people out there who use it and are building tools to make it more effective for them. And so some of those tools may be useful for you as well. So for example, one thing you can do is you can download a plugin that rearranges the way citations are keyed. That is the unique identifier for those citations. So it'll work better with BibTeX, which you need in order to create a LaTeX version of your document. And so somebody found that to be particularly useful, so that's in there. And there are lots of other tools that allow you to kind of make Obsidian what you want. I find with OneNote, like a lot of Microsoft tools, you're just kind of stuck doing what the developer wants you to be able to do with it. Yeah. Any other questions? Thoughts or comments? All right. Well, it doesn't seem like it. So I wanted to point out that there have been a number of other workshops in the GSE series so far, and a lot of those are recorded, and there are resources on the library's website. So you can find a lot of those. Oh yeah, that slide was from previous semesters, and then this one is the ones that we've had so far this semester. So if any of those seem useful or relevant, please take a look on the website, and you can find more content there. But otherwise, I just want to thank you for your time and for listening, and for all of you who might be listening in the future, thank you. And you can always get in touch with me at the library, jkenyon@uidaho.edu. Feel free to send me a question. Thank you.
Yeah.